Cool. I will use the next minutes just to introduce you very quickly. So Rachel is an assistant professor in environmental policy at ETH Zurich. She has quite a really impressive career. So she did her undergraduate in Boston University, then her master's in Columbia, and her PhD in Stanford, all related to some extent to environmental analysis and policy. And at the moment, she's working on issues of ecosystem services, land use change, and how to define or identify suitable conservation strategies. And today she will talk about the Brazilian Cerrado and whether or not the use of payment for ecosystem services tool is appropriate, or what are the challenges in the use of that tool. I would say that you can start whenever you want, Rachel, and the others can just join, hopefully silently. So please switch off all the ones that do not talk at the moment. Please switch off your audio. Thank you.
And this is a class from what I understood, or is it a lecture series? Because
it's a mixture. It's advertised as, or it's run as part of the an MSc degree program course, but also part of the Ridley to School seminar series. So you will have a lot of MSc degree students listening in, but also academic staff from across the school.
Okay, and so in that case, I thought it was more of a class. Amazing to have so many participants, but for sure people can ask questions for terminology that they don't understand, and I'm going to try to make sure to explain them, but feel free to even put in the chat window if you say, like, there's a word that I didn't explain and it's important for understanding, so that's no problem. I tried to make sure there wasn't too much content, but we'll see. So yeah, sorry, actually the title's not even correct. The title should have been more focused on the Cerrado, but I was so focused on the presentation, I didn't even focus on the title. So yes, this all started, actually, the reason I'm here today is because I got into a bit of a Twitter argument with an ecologist, Daniel Nebstad. And it's not the first time, but basically they're considering the adoption of a payments for ecosystem services program in the Brazilian Cerrado, which is a tropical savanna that's huge and has lots of soybean and cattle production. And it's not currently highly protected compared to the Brazilian Amazon. And he's arguing and has been in the Tropical Forest Alliance meetings also supportive of this payments for ecosystem services program. I have also participated in those meetings, and we cautioned against it. And now here we were trying to formalize these arguments a bit in a sort of perspective piece. And this is kind of a representation of why we think it's problematic. So just to give you guys a little bit more background, though, I'm sure you've probably already heard this in this type of lecture series and course, but the world keeps losing tree cover, at the net level. So of course there is some reforestation and natural regeneration happening globally, but still, just in the last 18 years, we lost 361 million hectares of tree cover. Now that's not all primary rainforests or primary tropical savanna. You can see here in the dark green, these areas that are still primary original native vegetation. But you can see that this tree cover clearing is increasingly happening in those regions. And just in the last 18 years, 60 million hectares of that clearing was primary tropical forests. So all of this tree cover lost globally is a vast, vast area covering much of Europe. And if we talk about tropical deforestation, it's about the size of Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. So it's a huge amount of area. It's kind of hard to make these concepts tangible sitting here. And then looking at a map of South America, for example, it's hard for you guys to know how big of an area that is, because you know, we have nothing comparable to that really in our tiny cities here in Europe. So, oops, it's going ahead a bit, but this, I guess from an ecosystem service perspective, this is a huge issue because it collectively, the actual full removal of trees, in addition to their degradation of the ones that are still standing, but where certain trees have been partially removed, or you know, vegetation from the ecosystem has been removed through climate change and fires and logging. All of that collectively accounts for 18%.
Please.
18% of the gross global carbon dioxide emissions, and more than all of the emissions from the EU. So it's a huge challenge with respect to climate change. And that's not even taking into account, like, additionally, all the other problems associated with it: biodiversity loss, the fact that it's failed to deliver development benefits to the people living there, its role in inciting conflicts and threats to indigenous populations, etc. I work in Brazil because it's been the region where the most tropical primary forest loss has been happening. In 2018, it was close to 1.5 million hectares, and it's actually been going up, unfortunately, in the last 2 years under the administration of Jair Bolsonaro. And in Brazil and elsewhere in the tropics, the primary driver of this deforestation is what we call commodities. So internationally traded. I seem to be on some kind of timer, unfortunately. Just give me 1 second. Presenter, slideshow, no timer, manually. Okay, good. So commodities are these internationally traded products, and food commodities are particularly implicated in deforestation in the tropics are beef cattle, soybeans, oil palm, cocoa, coffee, and in Brazil, it's for sure mostly beef cattle and soybeans. So all these red dots here are areas where large-scale pastures for beef cattle and large-scale clearings for cropland are driving deforestation. So in today's talk, I just wanted to start by giving you a little bit of background on how multinational companies are implementing supply chain policies to try to address this issue, that the products they're sourcing in places like Europe, in the United States, China, are associated with these risks of leading to deforestation. And for various reasons that I'm not going to get into today, but can answer during the questions section, they want to reduce that risk. They want to exclude products that have deforestation associated with them. And so they implement these supply chain policies. So I'm going to give you some background on that. And then I'm going to talk more specifically about how payments for ecosystem services can be used in this kind of ecosystem of supply chain mechanisms. And there has been a vast literature on the problems associated with payments for ecosystem services. So that's not the main contribution of this article, but to recap those, and then in section 3 to apply them to the Brazilian Cerrado is kind of the focus. To deliver this message specifically, our aim is to deliver this message to the policymakers who are debating this versus other alternatives. And finally, we discuss, of course, not only how the PES can be improved, but also what alternatives we see as better. And when I say things like better, there's multiple attributes that go into that. There's efficiency, effectiveness, equity, words that you're going to see here, and I'll try to make sure to describe them. So essentially what's happening in the world, as I just said, is that there's all of these companies, many of which, multinational companies, many of which are headquartered in Europe, or at least have some operations in Europe, and have been pressured over the last decade from various levers, public campaigns against them, now multiple policies actually even being supported at the level of the EU, to make them responsible for their sourcing practices and the deforestation associated with it. And this reflects like a larger turn in global food system governance, where the private sector is playing a really large role in telling people in distant places what they can and cannot do on their land. Obviously, there's a lot of problems with that from a power dynamics perspective. On the other hand, from a conservation perspective, that's an incredible leverage point and opportunity to try to reduce deforestation, especially in the particular historical context that we're in right now, where there had been some moments of high political support within the production regions for zero deforestation. And at the current moment, especially in Brazil, the federal government is not enforcing any of the deforestation policies. And so the private sector is particularly important at this moment in time. So essentially what they do is they set some kind of policy, either as part of a global international agreement. Oh, sorry, I just saw a chat question, but the deforestation on the maps I showed were between 2000 and 2018. So up to 2018. So companies set a policy either as part of an international agreement, or as individual company can just go on their own. And so here's an example of Nestle, which is headquartered in Switzerland, and they've made a commitment on zero deforestation. And essentially what they then need to do is direct everybody in their supply chain, what we call upstream of them. So this is whatever traders are involved or whatever manufacturers are involved in sourcing products, and then further upstream to the source, we've got the actual farmers. So then the farmers have to adjust their practices and not produce soybeans or beef or whatever, or oil palm on areas that were cleared after some cutoff date. And so a famous example, two of the most famous examples actually are in the Brazilian Amazon, where you have, say, companies like Cargill, ADM, Bunge, Louis Dreyfus, all agreeing that no deforestation can happen after 2008. If a producer clears after that point and grows soy there, they won't buy it. And 52 of the major food and wood sourcing companies have committed to policies that are at the level of stringency of saying we allow zero deforestation to occur on our suppliers' basis. Now, not all of those have been implemented globally, but it is particularly promising area to affect change. In terms of the parlance and jargon of governance, people call this flow-based governance, which was the shift from territorial governance. So territorial governance is a kind of a traditional regulatory approach that Brazil would take to say you can't clear on your property, whereas now it's shifting control to individual commodities and individual supply chains and focusing on that. Now, just to give you a preview of what I'll talk about at the end, the consensus these days is that actually territorial and flow should be reunited. One isn't better than the other. The two need to work together, and we call these integrated approaches. And also tending to focus on the landscape. So integrated landscape approaches is kind of the best way to go. But within the flow-based governance, considering there isn't always control to affect change at the territorial level, there is sovereignty issues of the producing regions. If we're just focusing on this flow-based governance, then we have three options, essentially. A traditional market exclusion mechanism, it's more of almost a regulatory approach. It's punitive. it means you don't get any rewards, but we won't source from you if you don't comply. I mentioned already the soy moratorium and the G4 cattle agreement are both in the Brazilian Amazon, and so is this terms of adjustment of conduct, that's the TAC, also for cattle. Then there are certification programs, and given the absence of other implementation systems, other market exclusion mechanisms, which actually do require quite a lot of cooperation with local governments, most companies have been relying on certifications as a way to verify that the people they're sourcing from don't produce on areas that have been recently cleared. So in oil palm, that's the roundtable on sustainable palm oil. In soybeans, they can use the roundtable on responsible soy certification. And for other commodities, Rainforest Alliance offers a certification. But actually the zero deforestation criteria are not very strong in those certification systems historically. And it was only recently added to the roundtable on sustainable palm oil. So I will get back to this question by Diogo at the end.
Yeah, Rachel, just to, you can ignore the questions in safe knowledge that we will just do it all at the end. So we will monitor the chat box, just ignore when the chat comes up. Really sorry about that.
Okay, fine, sure. So this can be used as some sort of positive incentive program where you can say, if you have a certification, we will give you some additional premium. That almost never happens. And instead it's actually defaults to being a market exclusion mechanism. If you don't have it, you're excluded. And because of that attribute of both of those other existing policy mechanisms, implementation mechanisms, there's been this increased focus on payments for ecosystem services, PES, because they actually provide some clear benefit to the land user for avoided deforestation. And so essentially, contrary to historical applications of these payments for ecosystem services, where a person is engaging in often reforestation to provide additional environmental services, the application of PES to zero deforestation cases is saying, we're paying you to not lose those ecosystem services. We're paying you for the avoidance of externalities. So you can imagine that's already a bit problematic to start with. But this has been, there's a role for this within the context of the REDD+ programs, reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, which provide financing for PES. And so essentially here, the idea is there are some beneficiaries who are willing to pay to the providers of environmental services. And so in flow-based governance, this means there are multinational companies that are willing to pay land users to not clear. So one big issue already is that companies don't comprise all of the actors in the world, and their willingness to pay for a service is not comprehensive of all of the benefits that society gets from avoided deforestation. So inherently, there's a limitation there. Right, so I've already gone through this. People are debating these three implementation mechanisms. Market exclusion has actually been highly effective. Now, when I say effective, I mean actually achieving the conservation goal that it sets out. So zero deforestation is the goal. They've actually been highly effective in soy, and they've been moderately effective in beef cattle in reducing deforestations. But unsurprisingly, soybean industry doesn't want a market exclusion mechanism because it's purely punitive. They don't believe in certifications really because they're not advocating for those because the benefits have not really materialized in terms of additional premiums, except maybe in the cases where it's linked to non-GMO, which is very limited. And so instead they favor this PEZ program, which is neither punitive, is not punitive, but also has more tangible benefits in that they're going to get paid for not deforesting. So, the other kind of more general academic arguments for PEZ, and the reason it came to be, is that like other market-based mechanisms, it's thought to be more efficient than a regulation because different actors have different costs associated with avoided deforestation. And so theoretically, with a scheme like this, say it was encompassing all of the, leveraging all of the willingness to pay globally for deforestation, avoided deforestation, that money would be going, would be able to match with producers' willingness to not clear their land at a particular price. Thus, the people who have a lower cost of avoiding deforestation, let's say because they have lower profits from agriculture to begin with, will be the first people to opt into this policy, right? So the cheapest cost producers of environmental services are the ones who get paid. And in that way, we can keep producing on the areas where the cost to society of not producing food might have been much higher. But as that works out, it really ends up just being equating to the soybean profits going to those farmers. So the higher profit farmers would not be likely to engage. In terms of effectiveness, in actually achieving its goals, people think that PEZ can be useful because instead of the government being in charge of everything, you have a trusted intermediary who's linking the payers and the providers, and that can reduce the role of corruption in terms of enforcement of a policy. The problem is, for this to actually work in practice, you still need the government involved in terms of setting up the appropriate monitoring systems and transparency systems. Another argument for it has been that it could be a more equitable policy because it offsets the income losses to those affected who are not clearing their land and producing food. And then I've already talked about it. Really, a major argument is that it's just more feasible. And this was actually Dan Nepstad's biggest argument. You can't get off the ground in these types of debates without offering to pay the sector something in return for not clearing. And so, you know, the literature has already basically made it very clear that there are numerous reasons why these fail to live up to promises, even on the conservation side. So with that, I mean, even in terms of just the effectiveness criteria. So let's leave aside equity and fairness and all that stuff for a second. There are problems with the scope of a PEZ program, monitoring and evaluation of properties to make sure that who should actually be paid. There's problems with targeting, making sure the right people, the ones who would have cleared otherwise, are the ones that actually participate. There's problems with enforcement of these contracts, especially because you're paying them typically somewhere at some intermediate time period and then making sure they also still continue to not clear into the future. There's problems with the longevity. A recent case out of Ecuador, I think, or Bolivia, or maybe Peru, somewhere in the Andes, showed that when they ended a PEZ program, immediately people went back to clearing. And then finally, we worry about spillovers, because if you just adopt this at some pilot scale in one region, there's lots of regions all over South America that have forests that can be cleared. So there's the Chaco forest, and there is the Amazon, and there's other regions in the Cerrado if you just focus on Mato Piba, which is a small part of the Cerrado. And there's also the Atlantic forest in the Brazilian Amazon. So there's lots of other regions that could still be cleared. So my main point about scope that I wanted to make is that PEZ are really inappropriate to use as a replacement for a regulatory approach. They're more convincing as an add-on. So I'll get back to that. But ultimately, the PEZ is going to be limited. Its effectiveness on conservation is going to be limited to whatever money you can leverage into the program. So the amount of money available to pay is going to determine the amount of conservation you achieve. And that is unlikely to be inclusive of all of the benefits that we get in society from not having deforestation. And therefore, it's going to lead to an under provision of avoided deforestation, under provision of conservation. Determining who's eligible for these payments at these vast landscapes of the size of multiple countries in Europe means that you have to have some really well-organized, transparent system where every property is mapped, their information is public, their deforestation activities are being regularly checked, and then you as a company can verify continuously that they're not defaulting on their contract. So, you know, thousands of properties across millions, tens of millions of hectares basically need to be monitored and linked to an individual seller. That is not trivial. And then to determine the right price, you need to know what their intention to clear would have been. And you also need to know what their opportunity costs of conservation are, what they could have gotten out of doing soybean production. For this to work, basically, you need to be targeting people that would have cleared in the absence of a payment. And you have to make sure they actually apply for the payment. And so these are in general, as I've mentioned, are only going to be the people who are getting the lower profitability from soybeans. Unless you set the PEZ price at the highest possible level, you're always going to get the kind of poorer, less lucrative soy farms. That's great. That's actually the one part of PEZ that's good, because maybe then you are having some pro-poor aspects. On the other hand, there is still the possibility, even if you got those people, that they would default because there's not really a high risk of contractual compliance, and there's no clear penalties associated with most PEZ programs. So we call it a moral hazard. Somebody will take the payment and then default. So that's the part that's actually pro-poor, and this other part would be inefficient and not effective. Now, in reality, you don't get everybody applying for payments. As I said already, it's going to exclude those people who are more profitable. And unfortunately, those are probably the ones who are the biggest risk for deforestation to begin with, because they have such high profits. Then you're also excluding a bunch of people just because they're not eligible. Maybe they don't have clear land tenure. Maybe they're not currently producing soy, but ultimately could in the future. And all of those people are not included. So like cattle ranchers, which is a huge amount of land area, are not included in this. So so you're missing them. So all of these are reasons why it's also, so the first one is a reason why it's not going to have the highest additionality, lead to the most conservation beyond business as usual. And this exclusion component is not equitable and also potentially inefficient. And then finally, as if there weren't already enough problems, you end up getting people who already wouldn't have cleared, but also, sorry, so that's actually F. Let me talk about that first. So you get this problem of adverse selection where people apply for the payment, but we're never going to clear in the first place. Maybe they didn't have, maybe they actually don't want to do more soy farming. They are at their limits of managerial capacity or capital availability, but then they're applying for the payment because they have forest available and are theoretically eligible. And then finally, it's inherently very inequitable because people who are intrinsically motivated to conserve, like all the indigenous groups in the area, don't have any opportunity to be paid. Enforcing it is hard because of the monitoring and evaluation components, and there's typically no mechanism to sort of withdraw payments or penalize somebody financially for being non-compliant. which enhances that moral hazard problem that I talked about. And then finally, not finally, there's actually the spillovers aspect. There's a problem of longevity, which I already mentioned, with these really capital intensive, profitable commodity systems like soybeans. It's highly unlikely that companies are going to be willing to pay billions of dollars in perpetuity. So this is just a stopgap at best. And some other spillover issues that we worry about is that you can crowd out people's conservation, intrinsic conservation incentives by basically introducing a payment for avoiding deforestation. So if people were just avoiding it because they felt it was the right thing to do, and now you say you're going to pay them to not do it, and especially if they weren't getting those payments, if they're not getting those payments at all, you might lead to people who were conserving before saying, hey, this is totally unfair, I should just clear then. And finally, you could skip, speculation is already a big problem in this region, and you could get now people just investing in the land, potentially even land that's already occupied by people without clear tenure. And you could get people trying to buy up that land just for the payments. I'm actually most concerned, in addition to all that, with these major ethical issues with PEZ. So ultimately, I think at a fundamental level, it's just really doesn't make sense for avoided deforestation, because you're switching the narrative in a way that can have vast repercussions in the global conservation dialogue, that all of a sudden people should be paid regardless of their wealth, regardless of their historical occupation of a region, regardless of any social attribute, which could be a justification for some remuneration. But you're broadly with this PEZ, especially for soy and Cerrado, you're saying we need to pay you for not creating damages to society, instead of saying, no, you're responsible for damages in some way and you should pay. In this particular process, there's a major procedural equity issue, which is that many people didn't get to participate in these discussions because they're not in the soy sector. So all of the indigenous people, all of the cattle ranchers, and all of the subsistence or more diversified farming systems are excluded. And then contextual equity is a big issue because people have different capacities to engage. And even the way they're talking about piloting this program is going to be with a limited set of soybean producers in a limited location in the Cerrado. The way I've always seen this play out in practice, and the way other people have seen it in other regions, is that it's already the larger, more well-connected landowners that that know about this PEZ, know how to go through the bureaucracy of applying, and can confirm their eligibility. And then it's always the poorest land users, especially landless people who maybe are using that land for actually like non-timber forest products, are not eligible for any kind of payment. And then finally, all of these fairness and contextual and procedural equity issues manifest in what we call distributional challenges, where the people who end up benefiting from the PEZ are the already rich ones, and the people who don't benefit are the ones who are already poor. And all of this is just likely to be the same as every other process historically in Brazil, which is that the scheme acts to further empower the sectoral interests that are already wealthy and already powerful, leading to further control of the political processes in Brazil, and inherently sanctioning polluting activities. So I think at a more meta level, like, this is the big problem with PEZ. So in the Cerrado, I don't want to take too much time, so I'll make sure I finish in the next 10 minutes. In the Cerrado, you have a large amount of deforestation happening. All these areas in brown are the areas of native savanna vegetation. Now, savanna, it means in some regions it's really shrubs. but in many regions, it's also like trees. So it's deforestation under some definitions, but ultimately the regions that we're talking about, I don't know if you can see my mouse, can you? Great. So these regions up here are regions at threat, and they are really like forests. And it's kind of a gradient where it goes from more forested to more shrubby, and I'm not an ecologist, so there's probably not the right terms. But soy and cattle are the largest drivers of deforestation. These are rich people, let's just put it that way, and they're actively expanding in Mato Grosso here, and this is the part we call Mato Piba, because it's 4 states, Maranhão, Tocantins, Piauí, and Bahia. And the major traders out of those regions, besides the domestic consumption, which is also handled by major traders and retailers, but just the part that's exported is 3 of the largest companies in the world for soy, ADM, Bunge, and Cargill. And Glencore, who's actually located also right here in Switzerland. So this is the leverage point. This is the reason why any kind of PES is being advocated, because there are European based traders who have this public pressure on them to do something. And actually the first people to do something are a handful of tiny companies. Well, not that Tesco is tiny, but it's only in the UK. So I don't want to offend you guys, but Tesco, you know, this UK retailer, actually UK retailers have always been out ahead on these environmental policies, but they've pledged, but their ability to affect change, let's say, compared to an ADM or a Bunge or Cargill is much smaller. And then Nutreco and Greek Seafood, which are 2 feed companies, all 3 of them have launched the preliminary steps towards a PES program already in the Cerrado. But at a bigger scale, with ADM, Bunge, Cargill, Dreyfus, and other actors, Amaji Group, the World Economic Forum, and what I've referred to already, the Tropical Forest Alliance, which is convened through the World Economic Forum, is aiming to pilot this program too, and is really supporting it a lot, and they're very powerful. So I'm just going to highlight 3 big issues. There is a lot of deforestation risk associated with soybeans. So any additional conservation program has a high potential effectiveness. It really can lead to avoided deforestation beyond business as usual, because right now, most of the forests remaining are not protected in any way. And you can see that these companies who have zero deforestation commitments, that's the ZDC here, actually occupy a large part of the market in many of these regions. That answers actually the market share question in the chat box. So yes, they do actually have a lot of control in those areas where there is a lot of forest remaining. So it is scope-wise, it could affect change, but it's really important to keep in mind that it's not a zero deforestation policy. It is not a substitute for a zero deforestation policy, because it's only going to achieve some limited amount of avoided deforestation based on how much money is available. And so unless that money is enough to cover every single actor effectively, it will not lead to zero deforestation. This is the part I was trying to pull together quickly and failed miserably, but we generated rent maps. We generated profit maps for soy. At least that's what we were trying to do. And I haven't masked out the Cerrado yet, but let me just flip over to this. These are gross revenues. They don't even take into account yet the operational costs, but the revenues that you get from soy per pixel. And all of this, ultimately, you calculate that, you take out the operating costs, and this would have been a better map, but then you would have seen that you can get roughly $250 per hectare in profits on this land, okay? That may not sound like a lot, but when people have 10,000 hectares, it becomes a lot. But it becomes a lot when you think about there's 8 million hectares of legally clearable land that are highly suitable for soy, not even moderately suitable, like literally really highly suitable for soy, and would be getting these $250 types of profits, that level. So that's $2 billion US per year that you'd have to be paying to avoid deforestation on those highly suitable areas of 8 million hectares. That's obviously a super high number. And yeah, and so this relates to the targeting issue. Unless you're paying out that full $2 billion per year, you're only going to get the people on, you're only going to really be attracting people in the marginally suitable areas probably. And those were the ones who are less of a deforestation risk to begin with, because then you're getting closer to, you know, in those marginally suitable areas, people might take the payment because they were already only going to get like $50 per hectare or less. In terms of these equity, these ethical considerations, yeah, the biggest problem here is that we're talking about avoided deforestation, and so we're switching it to, you know, it's just not fair, because these are really wealthy. I didn't phrase this right, but these are really wealthy people that didn't even live in that region and are now going to the region and buying land and now being paid for not clearing it. It's only for soybean actors, so it excludes all of the other. I think I've actually made most of these points. It excludes indigenous, excludes cattle ranchers, excludes others. And if it's limited to only a pilot phase, it's really going to probably exacerbate these contextual equity issues, because it's not even trying to include everybody. It's just going to be including sort of the already niche, well-networked farmers who basically kind of support even the trader in establishing the PEZ program. This is not done in any scientific way. Like, there's not going to be a randomized group of people that pay for it, that get it in a like well-selected region. It's actually being based on requests for proposals from the traders themselves. So that's already problematic. Okay, so I wanted to just wrap up. So in conclusion, and I unfortunately didn't pull together all the data that I wanted to for this presentation, but in conclusion, we are highlighting through this perspective that PEZ in general, and PEZ specifically among soy actors in the Cerrado, is likely to suffer from the following challenges. Monitoring and evaluating what the threat would have been in the first place is really challenging, and to enforce contractual compliance will be very challenging. It'll be very unlikely that they can target the right people due to the high costs of the high profitability of soy, and it'll be very unlikely that they can pay for that in perpetuity because of the high amounts of money involved. And therefore, because of all of those targeting problems and monitoring problems, it's probably not even likely to have a large effect and just cost a ton of money, which makes it highly inefficient. And then it's not going to deal with any of the spillover potentials to any other regions in South America, and it has massive fairness and equity concerns. This is an area where you can see in the drier parts of the Cerrado the types of vegetation that have been cleared for soy, and this is soy stubble. Okay, so what do we recommend? We recommend that you don't just consider PEZ in isolation, but that PEZ is always just an add-on to a market exclusion mechanism. Oops, that should just be gone. So we combine this PEZ and the market exclusion, and what we do is you implement the market exclusion as a baseline in all of the high deforestation risk areas, but to deal with the equity concern, you target PEZ only to the smallest poorest farmers to make sure that they aren't excluded from those supply chains and have the abilities to meet the expectations and maintain their livelihoods. So if you're going to do PEZ, really only focus it on offsetting income losses to the poorest people. But at the baseline, you have to have the market exclusion mechanism already in place for people who clear. And then finally, there's a lot of areas that have already been cleared here, you can see. And in those places, there's a lot of degraded pastures. And you could instead, if you want added environmental services, if you want to pay somebody for adding carbon sequestration for adding potential biodiversity habitat, then pay people to restore the already cleared areas and the degraded pastures. Finally, what we need to be doing in a bigger picture is supporting alternative development paths for the producers and the broader region. You can support sustainable agriculture. You can also develop the forest economy. So value chains for forest products, which happens more in the Amazon, and stimulating the non-resource based sectors. And then all of this can come into better alignment with Brazilian processes, so it's not dependent on external payments. They have legal actually grounding for PEZ programs and income distribution programs. And now this is already passed in the European Parliament that supply chain actors have to take responsibility for deforestation. So in that sense, the market exclusion mechanism becomes more feasible. That's it. I wanted to leave you with these references. Like I'll give you the presentation and then people can look at them later, but I'll leave it on this slide for now. Maybe I'll close it down so I can just see you guys.
Well, thank you, Rachel. I will stop the recording now, and then there have been quite a lot of questions. I will bring them up in a minute. It was really interesting talk. I have also questions, but I guess I can always ask them later on.
Yeah. Sorry, I was